Hey everybody, it's me again. Today I'm over here in Poro, Camotes Island, and I'm going to be interviewing Cindy Domingo. I've known her for a very very long time, and it's amazing. Both of us, her mom lives here from Camotes, and my dad is from Camotes, so that's something we have in common. And she's in Camotes right now, and I'm gonna interview her. Are you ready?
Yes, I
Okay.
am, Mario.
Okay, Cindy, the first question I asked is how old are you?
I just turned 70 years old
Wow,
in December.
congratulations.
Yeah, yeah.
Happy birthday and
Thank you.
congratulations. That's a milestone right there.
Thank you.
Okay, and second question is where were you born?
I was born in Texas, in the United States, in 1953.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, and I'm known you in 72 over in Seattle. So can you tell us where you went to school and a little bit about your childhood?
Okay. My father was in the Army, which is the reason, in the U.S. Army, and that's the reason we were born in Texas on a military base. And then he was stationed in Birch's Garden, and we lived there for 3 years. And then he was stationed in Seattle, Washington, where he eventually retired from Fort Lawton Fort Lawton Military Base in Magnolia. So I grew up in Ballard, and this is a predominantly white neighborhood. And if you ever found any families of color, it's because their fathers were in the U.S. military. And so I grew up there, went to high school there, and I still live in Ballard, and eventually bought a house in Ballard and have lived there probably most of my life since we moved to Seattle in 1960.
Oh, great. You mentioned about your father. Was your father part of the story, like the group of Filipinos that came in a really early time? Was he a part of that group?
Yes, during World War II, my father went to the United States as a 16-year-old with his two brothers, and worked in the agricultural fields and in the canneries. And then in World War II, he was drafted into the military. He said he didn't want to go fight in the military, but as a colonial subject of the United States, that was part of their contract in immigrating to the United States, is that they could be called up for military service. So it turned out to be a sort of blessing for him, because that's how he retired, with full military benefits from the U.S. Army. So he was part of the Philippine regiments that fought in the U.S. military forces, and eventually got the gold congressional medals that were awarded eventually just a few years ago to those Philippine military attachments.
Wow, that's another story itself.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful story about
Yes.
your father that I should
Yes.
do another interview with one of your
Yeah.
family members. But anyway, another thing about that is that's how your father met your mother, right? Because
Yes.
a lot of soldiers, they were assigned in the Philippines during the
Yes.
invasion of the Philippines,
Right.
and they end up marrying
Yes.
Filipinas, and a lot of them were Ilocanos and end up marrying Visayan,
Yes.
and that's the reason why. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yes. So it was already at the tail end of World War II. My father was sent here with his regiment to actually look for Japanese soldiers in the caves in Camotes, because there were still active Japanese soldiers hiding in those caves. And so he was at the market, and he was looking at fish. And he was 36 years old. My mother was only 16. And she says to him, "Do you know how to cook that fish?" And he says, "No." And she says, "Well, my mother does." And she invited, how forward, right? She invited my father to her mother's house. And that's how they met. And he came there and ate. And within a few months, asked for my mom's hand in marriage. And then eventually took her to Ilocos, because he was from Santa Maria and Ilocos. And my mother didn't even speak Ilocano, but in that couple months that she was there, she learned Ilocano. She learned Ilocano so well, people think she's Ilocano, because she still spoke it up until her death. And then they had two children here, my oldest brother Nemesio and Evangeline. And then my father became stationed in Texas, and he petitioned for my mother to come. And she took a boat. At that time you couldn't fly, but took a boat and arrived in San Francisco on a boat. And then they eventually moved to Texas.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice story.
Long
Another
journey.
nice story.
Yes, that's the story of the war brides. Yes, another very
Yes.
nice story.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, we got the early immigrants, the Manong story, and then the war bride story right there.
And almost all the war brides are almost passed away as well because, well, many of them were younger women like my mother, but they're already either passed away or in their 80s and 90s.
Yes, I did a video about war brides.
Oh, good.
You know, so and it
Yeah,
tells about that
important
story.
history, right? Because they're the ones that transformed the Filipino community from just manongs into families, and so they're so important to our history.
Yes. Okay, and going along, so you went to school in Ballard, which is the white community, and I know your family because of your political work and basically Salmi. So I have to mention Salmi because he was a big influence to me at that time too. So a question I always want to ask you is when Salmi got murdered, where were you and what were you thinking?
Okay. Well, first I want to say, Mario, just a few weeks ago I was talking to an old friend, Dale Borgeson, who said you were an excellent organizer during that period of time. And you helped organize Providence Hospital, and he remembers your skills a lot. So I just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so the question was, talk about Salmi?
Salmi, you know, when Kennedy died, everybody remembered what they were doing and stuff like that. And Salmi, everybody who knew Salmi knew what they were doing exactly.
Yes.
For example, for me, I still remember when I heard the news, we drove all the way to Harborview to see, and then my father was in Seattle at that time, and he was already there with Alonso. And when I got there, I remember my father just went like that. That means Salmi died, you know. So we were pretty sad, you know. I mean, that's how I remember it, you know.
Right.
It was
Right.
still, you know,
Right.
it's something I don't forget. So you being a sister, when did you learn about it and what were you feeling, and you know, and just talk about that day basically.
Okay. So that day was June 1st, 1981, and even though it's been over 40 years, like you, I remember that day. I had, so they were shot a little around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and when I arrived home a little after 5 o'clock from my job, I was living in Oakland at the time. I was working in the headquarters of the Union of Democratic Filipinos. And Dale Borgeson, who I just mentioned, lived upstairs with his family. And he came downstairs, he called me and he says, "Can I come down and talk to you?" And then he came down and he told me that Salmi and Jean had been shot in their union hall, and that they weren't sure what had happened. He didn't tell me that Jean had died on the spot at the union hall. He told me they were working at the union hall. They didn't know the details, but that Salmi had been rushed to Harborview, and that I was to pack my things, and that they had already booked flights to go to Seattle later that evening. So I packed my stuff, but you know, it didn't really sink in, you know, what had happened. I kept thinking, oh, they must be, you know, miscommunication, misinformation. How could something like that happen? So I packed, I was doing this study group. I packed my materials. I said, I'm sure I'll be back, you know, within the week. But I also packed a black dress outfit for, you know, a funeral. When I got to Seattle, I went to Harborview directly, and the waiting room for the ICU was full. By then they had more information, and just based that Jean had died immediately because he was shot through the heart with a bullet. They suspected already the Tulasan gang, and that they had put out, the police were already looking for the Tulasan gang members that might have been involved in the murders. Salmi, they said, had given already a dying declaration. I mean, he wasn't dead yet, but the paramedic had asked him, because they were trained to ask, after Salmi yelled for help after he got out of his seat from the Union Hall. He had been shot 5 times in the stomach, but he managed to get out to the road and call for help. Half a block away, a paramedic heard his call and came to him and said, "Do you know who shot you?" And he said, "Galoy," meaning Ben Galoy, one of the Tulasan members. And before he died, he motioned to his leg as if like a gun signal with his hand. And from that, they determined that he was trying to say Jimmy Ramil's name. So based off of that information that Salmi was able to give before he died, they picked up those 2 men immediately. Then in the following days, we were able to piece a theory together just within the week after Salmi died. And it was based on who Salmi was and what work Salmi and Jean were doing. Salmi was fairly well known in the Filipino community and the Asian American community. The Asian American community because of his work at the UW and in the efforts to save the International District as a neighborhood, but also because of his anti-Marcos work in the U.S. anti-Marcos movement. And so Salmi and Jean had just been elected officials of the Alaska Canning Workers Local 37 the year before. Salmi was the secretary treasurer and Jean was the dispatcher. Dispatcher had a lot of power to determine who was going to go to Alaska to work. And at that time, the Alaska Cannery Workers Union was very influential up and down the West Coast, because probably about 1 in 5 families had someone that went to Alaska to work. So it was a job. You could go work in a seasonal job that you could make a lot of money, even though you work real hard, and it's a very quick season. So they were jobs that it was in high demand, and had one of great history in the Filipino community. 1 month before Salmi and Jean were murdered, they had gone to the international convention of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, the most progressive union in the whole United States. It's a union that had international influence as well as domestic influence. It's a union that in the past had taken positions around other dictatorships. And at that time, the only U.S. labor union that had taken a position during that period of time of the Marcos dictatorship was the United Farm Workers Union, led by Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez, unfortunately, had gone to the Philippines at the invitation of the Marcos government, was wined and dined by Marcos, and came back in support of the Marcos dictatorship. That split their union, and the Filipino leaders, like Philip Veracruz, resigned in protest over Cesar Chavez's support for the Marcos dictatorship. So Salmi and Jean's actions to get the ILWU to eventually oppose the Marcos dictatorship was very threatening to the Marcoses. But their resolution that they presented at the May convention of the ILWU was at a starting point. It was to send an investigating team to the Philippines to investigate labor conditions. It didn't say anything about taking a position about the Marcos dictatorship, but said, send a labor team to investigate the conditions, to meet with the labor movement in the Philippines that was already underground because of the dictatorship. Before that resolution was implemented, before that delegation was even organized, Salmi and Jean were murdered. So it was obvious that the work that they were doing at the time of their murders threatened the Marcos dictatorship, because it would have been the beginning of the U.S. labor movement implementing true solidarity with the labor movement in the Philippines. And it's one that could have economic repercussions. So when the ILWU took a position at that time around the dictatorship in Chile led by Pinochet, they held up cargo in San Francisco from going to Chile and coming back from Chile. They have also taken positions around Israel, cargo that's going to Israel, and other, they're at that time the most progressive union. So Marcos definitely did not want any kind of cargo to be held up either way, coming from the Philippines or going out. So that's why they thought if they could murder Salmi and Jean, and they came up with a conspiracy to do that using the Alaska Cannery Workers Union president, Tony Barruso, and that Tulisan gang. If they could get rid of Salmi and Jean, they thought that work would end. But it didn't end, and those in the Local 37 continued the work of Salmi and Jean. And today, many labor unions have taken a position to fight for democracy in the Philippines.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been talking to a lot of Filipinos about, what happened, and they believe, the angle about the Tulisan and Tony Barroso. But when I bring up, the Marcos, they said it's too far out for them.
Right.
And I'm glad you explained it in a clear way, how how the Marcoses were involved and what was the significance of it.
Well, and when you tell people, that wasn't just us that said that. We brought a federal lawsuit in the courts with a jury that were not Filipino, that heard the evidence that we outlaid about the murders and how the Marcoses were responsible. And they were the ones that granted a $23.5 million judgment against the Marcoses and Tony Barruso and one of the doctors that filtered the money for the murders. So it wasn't just our theory, it was proven in court, in a court of justice, endorsed by a judge, that is how the murders happened, that the Marcoses were responsible for what we called a Philippine infiltration plan that harassed and monitored and eventually killed Salmi and Jean.
Yes. I mean, in fact, they even killed Ninoy Aquino.
Right. So if you can kill Ninoy Aquino in front of an international audience, yes. I mean, every time I watch that film, I am just in awe of the brazen boldness of the Marcos dictatorship to do that in front of an international
And there's
audience.
A lot more.
Oh,
there's so many more that got killed, and people don't even know.
Don't even know, right?
Yeah. Okay, so another question I want to ask, because you know what's going here. You're in the Philippines right now, and you know what's going on in the Philippines. The Marcos are back, and they basically rewrote history.
Right.
And what do you think about it?
Well, money has been able to do that for the Marcoses, and social media. So I think it's all the more important that, first of all, we establish what true history is. I mean, telling this story of Salmi and Jean by those that still remember the story, that those that live the story, is so important. The story of many, many others. The work that I think you interviewed Chel Diokno, and the work maybe he does around Bantayog. The work that Bantayog does is very important, because those are the martyrs and heroes that fought for democracy during the Marcos dictatorship. All of that history is important to reestablish and to fight the disinformation. Because if you don't have truth, you can't have justice, and if you don't have truth about what happened in the past, what the Marcos family did not only in terms of human rights violations, but stealing the wealth of the country. And they stole the wealth of the country, and that's how they were able to pay for social media, for the spread of misinformation, the control of media. So we have to fight. We have to fight to reestablish true democracy in the Philippines. I'm an American citizen. I was born in the United States, but I still care and love the Philippines because this is my history, this is my culture, and it's part of me. And we in the United States have a responsibility to ensure democracy is implemented fully in the Philippines. So that's why I continue to come here. I continue to my Philippine solidarity work, and I am really concerned about what's happening in the Philippines. You know, so many, Chel Diokno, when he was in Seattle on a national tour, he talked about you don't need a dictatorship here in the Philippines to be able to do what Marcos did, the first Marcos did, because the court system, the corruption in the political system has enabled Bongbong Marcos to continue the dismantling of democracy in this country. I mean, you know, that's why I'm here now, because they're facing another constitutional crisis with Bongbong Marcos wanting to change the Constitution. A constitution that under Cory Aquino was one of the most democratic constitutions in the world. But now it may be dismantled to enable the Marcoses to continue control, to enable corporations to exploit working people here in this country. I went to the grocery store. I saw the prices. I can't imagine how people eat anymore in this country, especially poor people.
Yes.
So.
And the salary hasn't gone up.
No. You know, people describe to me the cost of rice. I was in the grocery store. I saw the cost of onions. Last year when I was here, the high cost of onions, and then I see it in garlic, everything, you know. And I don't know what's ahead for the Philippines, especially if the constitutional changes, which would dismantle the Congress, which would go to a prime minister. Everything that we've worked for after the Marcos regime was overthrown will be completely dismantled. So I think the elections are in 2025, and the struggle over whether or not those constitutional changes as wanted by the Marcoses will happen.
Another question I really want to ask you is, where did this activism came from? I mean, the Domingo family in Seattle is very well known as a family of activists. And where did it came from? How did it happen? I mean, why is your family so involved in social justice and every rights of Filipinos, and not only Filipinos but the whole United States?
Well, I think there's two reasons. Three reasons. One is I always told my mom and dad always asked that. And we said, well, the activism came from them. Even though we lived in Ballard, a white community, my parents were always very active in the Filipino community. We grew up being Filipino. We always went to the Filipino community. And they were very involved in all the organizations, the regional organizations, the veterans organizations. So that's a certain type of activism, you know, in terms of engagement of the Filipino community and trying to better the community as well as the lives of the Filipino community. We even tried to transform, you know, the leadership of the Filipino community at that time. And so that type of activism came from my parents.
Okay.
But also, some of us, me and Lynn and Salmi and Vanjie and Nemisho, grew up in a fairly turbulent time in U.S. society. I mean, I always say I was fortunate to grow up in that time because that's where my true activism really got established. You know, it was the 1960s and 70s. There was the Vietnam War. There was the efforts to save the International District as a neighborhood. On the campus, there were solidarity movements and solidarity with the liberation movements in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and fights for Asian American studies, the efforts like you were involved in organizing Filipinos. So it was a very exciting time that was influenced by international as well as domestic politics. So I, as well as my brothers and sisters and many of our friends, grew up in that period.
That generation.
Yeah, that generation which was influenced by all of those movements and politics. And so that continues to influence me today, to be concerned, that we in the United States have a particular role because we go around the world oppressing peoples of the world, and that working class people continue to have that fight against those that own capital. So it's a lifelong family struggle. But as you've said, it's a generational influence also. So many of the children of our family, the younger generation, continue to carry on as trade unionists, active in different issues in the Filipino community. Nemesio's daughter is the latest one to enter into labor politics. She works at Macy's, has worked at Macy's for 20 plus years, and became an active spokesperson for the latest Macy's effort, Macy's Union, the United Food and Commercial Workers 3000, to fight for the workers' rights at Macy's stores in Washington State.
Wow.
So it's really, it's nice. It makes it nice when you're at a family dinner because you don't have any Trump supporters, you don't have any anti-union people. It really is a family effort to get involved with bettering the situation, the conditions of workers.
Because most family, there's always that arguments,
Right.
But
Well, we don't have that in our family. It makes family dinners and weddings and everything so much nicer. Yeah,
Yes.
And it gives us something to talk about.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, during the Macy's, they had a strike over the Thanksgiving holiday, and I think at one picket line, there were 16 of us at the picket line to support my niece, Asia Domingo. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's
Wow.
a family effort.
Every time I go to a place that I don't know what their politics is, the first thing I say is, let's not talk politics.
Right. Yeah.
Until I found out what their politics
Yes.
is, and then
Yeah.
that's when I open
Yeah.
up.
Right.
But in the meantime, I just keep my mouth shut,
Right,
'cause
yeah.
I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. I do that here in the Philippines, right? Because you don't know what people's politics are. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. We're doing this. We got 30 minutes now, and I have to leave. It's already 10:45. Can I do a follow-up?
Yes,
So I can
definitely.
do a part 2 because I want to talk about your husband,
Okay.
Gary, and more
Yes,
things. I want to
yeah.
talk about. Actually, I want to get hold of Nemesio because I want to, because I was part of that lawsuit.
Oh, okay. Well,
so-
maybe when you come home, we'll go visit him. I'll
Okay.
bring you there. Yeah.
Okay, that
But
sounds
thank
good.
you, Mario, for telling my story.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
We're not done yet. So and there's
Oh,
part 2. So
okay.
this is part 1.
All right.
So,
All right. Good to see you here.
I know. Here in Camotes, a
Yes,
great place.
yes.
I have to tell you something. I've been here before. Your mom found out I was in town, so she had somebody pick me up on the motorcycle.
really?
So
And
went
bring
down
you-
to San Francisco, looked for me, and found me, and got me here because she wanted to see me. And we had a small reunion here. So
Oh,
I've been
nice.
here before. That was in the 1990s. That was years
Oh
ago.
yeah. I miss our families. I miss getting together. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
always so nice to get together. Yeah. So
Okay.
nice to see you here.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
I'll be back.
All right.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye.